This story is titled, My Wife Left for a Month-Long Trial with Her Lover, saying she'd choose between us after, but I made it simple by filing for divorce. Alright, so, I guess I'm writing this because I need to get it out of my system. My name's Mike. I'm 31, and until recently, I thought I had my life figured out. I've always been a pretty simple guy. No wild ambitions, no crazy drama. I've got a steady job as a software developer, a decent house in a quiet neighborhood, and until not too long ago, I thought I had a strong marriage with a woman I truly loved. Laura and I met about 8 years ago, and looking back, it feels like a lifetime ago. I was 23, fresh out of college, working my first job, and honestly, pretty clueless about life. She was 22 and working as an assistant at a marketing agency while still figuring out her own career path. For the record, she never did and ended up a stay-at-home wife. We met at a mutual friend's barbecue, one of those casual backyard setups where everyone's holding cheap paper plates and someone's always burning the burgers. She was the one who approached me, cracking some sarcastic joke about how I looked like I was strategizing my escape plan. I don't even remember my response, but she laughed, and somehow we ended up chatting for the rest of the evening. From that point on, things moved pretty fast. We started dating, and it felt like she added this spark to my otherwise dull and predictable life. Laura was adventurous and spontaneous, always planning last-minute road trips or dragging me to try some new restaurant she'd read about. Meanwhile, I was the grounded one. I'd be the one figuring out the budget, checking the weather, or double-checking the gas tank before we hit the road. It worked, or at least it felt like it did. We balanced each other out. She brought excitement into my world, and I gave her a sense of stability she said she hadn't had in past relationships. 3 years into dating, we decided to tie the knot. The wedding was small, just family and close friends. Neither of us came from wealthy families, so there was no giant ballroom or fancy catering, but it didn't matter. After the wedding, we started building a life together. We bought a small 2-bedroom house in a quiet suburb. Not the fanciest place, but it had potential. For the most part, things felt stable. I'd go to work, come home, and Laura would usually be in the kitchen or lounging on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She'd tell me stories about her day. She worked in marketing back then, so there was always some drama with clients or co-workers, and I'd listen. That was our dynamic. She was the talker, the one with all the stories, and I was the listener. We didn't have kids, but that was a mutual decision. Laura wasn't in a rush, and honestly, neither was I. We both wanted to wait until we were more financially secure and ready for that next big step. It felt like we were on the same page about most things. Looking back, though, I wonder if I got too comfortable. It's easy to fall into routines, especially when life feels steady. I'd get up, go to work, come home, and repeat. We had our date nights, of course, usually dinner at one of our favorite spots or a movie, but I guess I stopped noticing the little things, like how Laura seemed to thrive on attention. It wasn't a bad thing, at least not at first. She's the kind of person who could light up a room, and people naturally gravitate toward her. I think I started taking that for granted, assuming her energy and warmth were just a constant part of our life together. At the time, though, I wasn't worried. I thought we were solid. Sure, we had our arguments now and then. What couple doesn't? Most of the time, it was over stupid things, like me forgetting to take the trash out or her leaving her shoes all over the house. Nothing major. But there's this thing about relationships. They can look fine on the surface while cracks are quietly forming underneath. And if you're not paying attention, those cracks can spread until the whole foundation starts to crumble. I didn't see it coming. Not then, anyway. I thought we were building something strong, something that would last. But sometimes life has a way of showing you just how wrong you are. 2 years ago, our lives got a new character, Jake. Jake moved in next door after the old neighbors, an older couple, downsized and moved to Florida. He was about 28 at the time, younger than most of the folks in the neighborhood. He was a personal trainer, fit, confident, and honestly, a little too good-looking for his own good. He had that kind of physique that made people double-take, like he just stepped out of an action movie. From the second he moved in, Jake was hard not to notice. Not just because of how he looked, but because he was always outside doing something. Washing his car, mowing the lawn, setting up a pull-up bar in his yard. There was always a reason for him to be shirtless. It didn't take long for him to become the talk of the neighborhood. Laura noticed him right away. How could she not? The first time we officially met Jake was when he came over to introduce himself while we were in the yard one Saturday morning. He was friendly, the kind of guy who could charm anyone. Laura struck up a conversation with him almost instantly, asking where he was from, what he did for work, and how he liked the area. I remember standing there, smiling and nodding, barely getting a word in while the two of them chatted like old friends. At the time, I didn't think anything of it. Laura was outgoing. She talked to everyone. she'd be just as chatty with the mail carrier or the guy at the hardware store. It didn't occur to me that there was anything different about her interest in Jake. But looking back now, I can see the small shifts that started happening after that. It began with the casual conversations. Whenever Jake was outside, Laura would find a reason to be outside too. At first, it was little things, grabbing the mail, watering the plants, taking out the trash. But somehow, these quick tasks always turned into 10 or 15-minute chats with Jake. One time, I came home from work and found them talking in the driveway. Laura was holding a basket of laundry she'd been taking to the garage, and Jake was leaning casually against his car, laughing at something she said. When I walked up, they both turned to me, and Laura acted like it was no big deal. Jake was just telling me about his new gym equipment, she said, like it was the most normal thing in the world. It didn't stop there. A couple of weeks later, Laura decided to bake cookies, something she hadn't done in months. I didn't think much of it until I saw her walking across the yard with a plate of cookies in hand. Just being neighborly, she said when I asked her about it. I shrugged it off. It wasn't unusual for Laura to do things like that. She'd brought brownies to other neighbors before. But then, there was the time she bought a new set of workout clothes, bright, fitted leggings, and a matching top. Not the kind of thing she'd normally wear. I asked her about it, and she told me she was thinking about starting to jog again. You know, to get back in shape, she said. I didn't question it. Laura had gone through fitness phases before, where she'd get excited about working out for a month or two, and then lose interest. But this time, her timing was convenient. You see, Jake jogged almost every morning. I'd see him out there, earbuds in, running laps around the block. And wouldn't you know it, Laura decided her new jogging routine would start at the exact same time Jake was out there. One morning, I caught them chatting on the sidewalk when I was leaving for work. Laura was stretching, and Jake was showing her some kind of technique to avoid shin splints. I didn't say anything, just gave a small wave and drove off. But something about the scene stuck with me. It was around this time that I started noticing Laura's phone habits changing too. She'd always been glued to her phone, scrolling through social media, texting her friends. But now, she seemed guarded. There were a couple of times I walked into the room, and she'd quickly lock her screen or flip her phone over like she didn't want me to see it. One night, I noticed she was scrolling through Instagram, and when I glanced over, I saw Jake's name at the top of the screen. She quickly swiped past it, but I caught enough to know she was looking at his profile. When I asked her about it, she brushed it off. I was just checking out his fitness posts, she said. He's got some good workout tips. I wanted to believe her, so I let it go. But the little things kept piling up. Another time I was working in the garage when I heard laughter coming from the backyard. I stepped out to see Laura and Jake standing near the fence, laughing about something. Laura was holding a glass of iced tea, and Jake was gesturing animatedly as he told some kind of story. When Laura saw me, she waved like nothing was out of the ordinary. Jake was just telling me about this funny thing that happened at his gym, she said later when I asked her about it. It was starting to feel weird. I don't want to sound paranoid, but you can tell when something's off. There was this new energy in the way Laura talked about Jake. She'd casually mention things he said or did, like Jake's thinking about getting a dog, or Jake recommended this great protein shake. It wasn't what she was saying, it was how she was saying it. And then there were the glances. You know the kind I mean. When we were outside and Jake happened to be around, I'd catch Laura stealing little looks in his direction. It was subtle, but once you start noticing it, you can't unsee it. At this point, I still hadn't said anything. Part of me didn't want to believe there was anything to worry about. I trusted Laura. We'd been together for years, and I thought we had a good thing going. But another part of me, the part that couldn't ignore the pattern, was starting to wonder. I decided to keep quiet for now, but I started paying closer attention. If something was happening, I needed to see it for myself. It was a Saturday morning, and I remember it clearly because it started so damn normal. I woke up early, like I usually do, made myself a cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table scrolling through the news on my phone. Laura was still in bed, which wasn't unusual. She liked her lazy mornings, especially on weekends. The house was quiet, just the sound of the coffee machine humming in the background, and for a moment, I actually felt relaxed. Funny how that works. You think everything's fine because you have no idea what's coming. Laura came into the kitchen about an hour later. She was in her pajamas, hair still messy from sleep, holding her phone in one hand and rubbing her eyes with the other. She sat across from me at the table, and I could tell something was up right away. She had this nervous energy about her, tapping her fingers on the table, glancing at her phone like she was avoiding eye contact. "You okay?" I asked, setting my phone down. She nodded quickly, then shook her head. "Actually, no," she said, letting out a deep breath. "We need to talk." Now anyone who's been in a relationship knows those 4 words rarely mean anything good. My stomach tightened, but I tried to play it cool. "All right," I said. leaning back in my chair. What's going on? Laura hesitated, her eyes darting around the room like she was trying to find the right words. Finally, she looked at me and said, I don't know how to say this, so I'm just going to say it. I think I have feelings for Jake. For a second, I thought I misheard her. What? I asked, leaning forward like getting closer would help the words make more sense. She bit her lip, looking genuinely uncomfortable. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said quickly, like she needed to get ahead of the backlash. It just happened. I've been spending time with Jake, and I feel this connection, and now I'm confused. Confused? That word hit me harder than anything else. She didn't just say she felt guilty or that it was a mistake. She said she was confused, like this was some kind of dilemma she needed to figure out. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. My mind was racing. Was she saying she wanted to leave? Was she asking for a divorce? Was she trying to confess and move on? I couldn't tell, and that made it worse. So, what does this mean? I asked finally. Are you saying you're done with us? Laura shook her head quickly. No, not necessarily, she said. I don't know what I want right now. I love you, Mike. I do. But I can't stop thinking about him, and I need to figure out what these feelings mean. I felt like the floor had been pulled out from under me. We'd been together for years, built a life together, and now she was telling me she wasn't sure if she wanted to be with me anymore. It was surreal. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. So what are you saying? You want to take a break? She hesitated, then nodded. Kind of, she said. I need time to figure things out. I was thinking, maybe I could take a month to spend some time with Jake and see if there's something real there. If it doesn't work out, then we can focus on us. I blinked, completely stunned by her audacity. You're serious, I said, not even phrasing it as a question. Laura nodded, her eyes pleading. I know it sounds crazy, but I don't want to throw away what we have without being I don't want to live with regrets, you know? Regrets. That word stuck in my head like a splinter. She was talking about regrets like she was the one risking everything, like my feelings were secondary to her figuring out her life. I sat there, staring at her, a mix of anger and disbelief bubbling under the surface. Part of me wanted to blow up, to tell her how selfish she was being. But another part of me, maybe the calmer, more calculating part, decided to stay quiet and let her dig her own hole. All right, I said finally, leaning back in my chair. Laura blinked, clearly caught off guard. Wait, really? Sure, I said, shrugging like it was no big deal. If you think that's what you need, go ahead. Her expression shifted, like she wasn't sure if I was being genuine or sarcastic. I just think it's the best way to figure out where my heart is, she said cautiously. Sure, I repeated. Do what you need to do. Inside, I was already done. The second she said she wanted to spend a month with another man, my brain flipped a switch. But I didn't want to show my cards just yet. If she was willing to throw away our marriage for some fantasy with the neighbor, I wanted to see how far she'd take it. Laura let out a relieved sigh, like she'd just been granted permission to do something heroic. Thank you, she said, reaching across the table to touch my hand. I know this is a lot to ask, but I really believe it's the right thing for us. I pulled my hand away, standing up and grabbing my coffee mug. Sure, I said again, my tone flat. If that's what you need. She didn't say anything after that, just sat there, probably processing the fact that I wasn't arguing or putting up a fight. But inside, I was already making plans. Over the next few days, Laura started packing a small bag. She told me she'd be staying with Jake, and she made it sound so casual, like it was just another temporary thing. She didn't even seem to notice that I wasn't asking any questions or putting up any resistance. The day Laura left, the house felt different. Not empty exactly, but quieter, like someone had turned the volume down on my life. I stood in the living room after she walked out, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder, and I just stared at the door. I thought I'd feel angry or heartbroken, but all I felt was this strange calm, like the weight of pretending everything was okay had finally lifted. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and just stood there, trying to process what had just happened. My wife, someone I'd been with for years, someone I thought I'd grow old with, had left to figure things out with the guy next door. If it weren't my life, I'd have thought it was some ridiculous TV drama. The first few days were strange. I started noticing the little things she'd left behind. Her favorite mug on the kitchen counter, a pair of shoes near the door, a blanket tossed over the back of the couch. I thought about moving them, but then I decided to leave them where they were. Not because I missed her, but because I didn't want to waste the energy. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects to fill my time. I stayed late at the office, not because I needed to, but because I didn't want to go home to that empty house. When I wasn't working, I hit the gym, hard. I hadn't been a regular gym goer before, but there was something satisfying about pushing myself physically, like I could sweat out all the frustration I was feeling. friends started to notice something was off. A couple of them asked why Laura wasn't around, and I gave them vague answers. She's staying with a friend for a bit, I said, trying to sound casual. I wasn't ready to get into the real story yet. My dad was the only person I told the truth to. I called him a few days after Laura left, and the first thing he said was, "What's wrong?" He's always been good at reading me, even over the phone. When I told him what happened, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then he said, "Well, son, I hate to say it, but it sounds like you're better off without her." At first, I wasn't sure how to respond. I'd expected him to be more upset, or at least ask more questions. But then he said something that stuck with me. "If she doesn't know your worth, why should you wait around for her to figure it out?" He was right. I'd spent so much time trying to make sense of Laura's decision, trying to figure out where I went wrong, that I hadn't stopped to think about what I deserved. I wasn't just some option for her to come back to if her fling with Jake didn't work out. That night, I sat in the dark living room, staring at the wedding photo on the mantle. We looked so happy in that picture, so sure of our future. But now, it just felt like a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. By the end of the week, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to sit around waiting for Laura to make her grand decision. I was going to make my own. The next day, I called a divorce lawyer. Sitting in that lawyer's office was surreal. I explained the situation, trying to keep my voice steady, even though part of me still couldn't believe it was real. The lawyer listened carefully, nodding as I talked, and when I was done, he said, "You're well within your rights to file for divorce. This kind of situation falls under irreconcilable differences." Hearing those words made something click in my brain. Irreconcilable differences. That's what we'd become. Laura and I weren't on the same page anymore, and maybe we never had been. The lawyer walked me through the process, explaining what I needed to do and what to expect. By the time I left his office, I felt a strange sense of relief, like I was finally taking control of my own life. Back at home, I started taking small steps to prepare for the inevitable. I moved some money into a separate account, just in case things got messy later. I went through the house and started mentally dividing up what was mine and what was hers. I didn't touch her stuff yet. I figured I'd wait until things were official. But in my mind, I was already making plans for what the house would look like without her. The days turned into weeks, and I started getting used to the quiet. It wasn't as bad as I'd thought it would be. In fact, it felt kind of peaceful. I didn't have to deal with Laura's constant chatter, or the little arguments over stupid things, like whose turn it was to do the dishes. Meanwhile, I started hearing things through the grapevine. A neighbor mentioned seeing Laura and Jake at the park together, looking cozy. Another one said they'd spotted them at a cafe downtown. I nodded and smiled, acting like it didn't bother me. But inside, I felt a mix of anger and pity. Anger because she'd thrown away everything we had for some fling with a guy who probably wouldn't stick around. Pity because I knew it wouldn't end well for her. Jake didn't strike me as the type to settle down, and Laura was going to find that out the hard way. By the third week, I'd stopped checking my phone for messages from Laura. I figured if she wanted to talk, she'd reach out. But I wasn't holding my breath. I was done waiting for her. One night, while I was cleaning out the garage, I found a box of old photos from when Laura and I first got together. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness, remembering how happy we'd been back then. But then I thought about all the little red flags I'd ignored over the years, all the times I'd put her needs ahead of mine without even realizing it. I closed the box and pushed it aside. I didn't need those memories. It was almost a full month to the day when Laura decided to make her grand return. I hadn't heard much from her during her little trial with Jake. The few texts she sent were vague at best. "Hope you're doing okay," or "We'll talk when I'm back." She didn't even try to give me updates or pretend she was torn about her decision. It was like she'd already written me off as plan B. By this point, I'd stopped caring. I wasn't waiting by the door, hoping she'd come to her senses. I wasn't pacing the house, wondering what she and Jake were up to. I'd filed for divorce and my lawyer had already started drafting the paperwork. As far as I was concerned, the marriage was over. But I didn't tell her that. Not yet. When she walked through the door, it was like nothing had changed. For her, anyway. She had her bag slung over her shoulder, her hair perfectly styled, and this confident look on her face. Like she'd just come back from a vacation and expected me to roll out the red carpet. "Hey," she said, setting her bag down by the door. "I'm back." I was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels, and barely looked up. "Welcome back," I said, keeping my tone neutral. She paused, like she was expecting more of a reaction. When I didn't jump up or ask her how it went, she walked over and sat on the arm of the couch. "We should talk," she said, her voice soft and careful. I muted the TV and turned to face her. "All right," I said, crossing my arms. "Talk." Laura smiled, the kind of smile she used when she was trying to smooth things over. "I've done a lot of thinking," she began, "and I've realized some things about myself. About us. About what I want. I just nodded, waiting for her to continue. She took a deep breath, like she was about to deliver some heartfelt speech. I care about you, Mike. I really do. And I think we can work through this. I think we can rebuild what we have. Rebuild. She said it like it was as simple as fixing a leaky faucet. I didn't say anything, just kept looking at her, letting her fill the silence. She seemed a little thrown off by my lack of response, but kept going. Jake's a great guy, she said, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing at how casually she brought him up. But I realized he's not what I need. He's fun, sure, but he's immature. He doesn't have the stability that you have, and I think I was just caught up in the excitement of it all. There it was, her big revelation. She'd tried out the shiny new toy and decided she liked the old one better. Uh-huh, I said, my voice calm. Laura blinked, like she was expecting more of a reaction. I know I've hurt you, she said, reaching out to touch my arm. But I really believe we can get past this. We've been through so much together, Mike. We have history. That's not something you just throw away. I let her finish, let her spill all her carefully rehearsed lines about love and forgiveness, and starting fresh. Then, when she finally stopped talking, I stood up and walked over to the kitchen counter. I opened a drawer, pulled out the stack of divorce papers my lawyer had sent over, and set them on the table in front of her. What's this? She asked, her smile faltering. Divorce papers, I said simply. Her face went pale. You're kidding, she said, letting out a nervous laugh. Nope, I said, leaning against the counter with my arms crossed. I'm not kidding. For a moment, she just stared at the papers, like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Then she looked up at me, her eyes wide. You're divorcing me? Yeah, I said, my tone steady. I'm not interested in being your second choice, Laura. Her expression shifted from shock to anger in an instant. Second choice? She snapped. That's not what this is. I was confused, Mike. I needed time to figure things out. And in the process, you decided to test the waters with another man, I said, keeping my voice calm. You left. You walked out on our marriage. And now you're back, because it didn't work out with him. Do you honestly think I'm just going to take you back like nothing happened? Laura opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again, her face turning red. It's not like that, she said, her voice shaking. I was trying to do the right thing. I didn't want to stay and resent you. I thought, she trailed off, her eyes darting around the room. You thought you could have it both ways, I finished for her. She stood up, crossing her arms. You're making a mistake, Mike. We can fix this. I know we can. No, I said firmly. We can't. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. She looked like she was about to cry, but I didn't let it sway me. I'd already made up my mind. The rest of the conversation was a blur. She tried to argue, to guilt me into changing my mind. She brought up our history, our house, even the idea of starting a family someday. But none of it worked. Eventually, she stormed out of the house. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space where she'd been, and felt nothing. No sadness, no regret, no second thoughts, just relief. Later that night, I called my lawyer to let him know Laura had seen the papers. How'd she take it? He asked. Not great, I said, smirking. Do you want to give her time to process, or should we move forward? Move forward, I said without hesitation. It wasn't easy, standing up to Laura like that. But in the end, it was the right thing to do. She treated me like an option, like I was just a backup plan in case her fling didn't pan out. And if she thought I was going to accept that, she clearly didn't know me as well as she thought. I knew she wouldn't give up easily. Laura wasn't the type to just walk away from a fight, especially not one where she felt like she was losing. I'd barely had time to sit down when my phone buzzed with a text from her. This isn't over. I stared at the message for a second before locking my phone and tossing it on the couch. She was right. It wasn't over. Not yet. But it would be soon enough. The next couple of days were eventful, to say the least. Laura showed up unannounced the following evening, banging on the door like she was trying to knock it down. Mike, open the door, she yelled. I opened it, keeping my expression neutral. What do you want, Laura? She pushed past me, storming into the living room like she still lived here. We need to talk, she said, pacing back and forth. You can't just file for divorce without giving me a chance to fix things. I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. You had your chance, I said calmly. You made your decision when you left. That's not fair, she shot back, her voice rising. I didn't leave to end our marriage. I left to figure things out, to make sure I wasn't making a mistake by staying. I couldn't help but let out a dry laugh. And in doing that, you proved you didn't value what we had. You don't test a marriage by running off to someone else, Laura. That's not how it works. She stopped pacing and turned to face me, her eyes red with frustration. I was confused, she said, her voice cracking. I didn't know what I wanted, but I know now. I want us, Mike. I want to fix this. Too late, I said, my tone firm. You don't get to come back now just because things didn't work out with Jake. Her face twisted with anger, and she pointed a finger at me. You're being petty, she snapped. You're throwing away everything we built over one mistake. I shook my head, keeping my composure. It wasn't just one mistake, Laura. It was a series of choices. You chose to flirt with Jake. You chose to prioritize your feelings for him over our marriage. And then you chose to leave. Those weren't accidents. They were decisions. She opened her mouth to argue but stopped herself, her shoulders slumping. For the first time, she looked defeated. What am I supposed to do now? She asked quietly. I sighed, feeling a pang of pity for her, even after everything she'd done. That's not my problem anymore, I said. You made your choices. Now you have to live with them. She stayed for another minute, looking like she wanted to say something else, but eventually she just walked out without another word. The divorce process moved quickly after that. Laura tried to drag things out at first, probably hoping I'd change my mind. She even tried to play the victim with our mutual friends, telling them I was being cold and unforgiving. My dad, on the other hand, was fully on my side. When I updated him on the situation, he let out a low whistle. She's got some nerve, he said. But I'm proud of you, son. Standing your ground isn't easy, but it's the right thing to do. Laura's attempts to stall didn't get her very far. My lawyer was sharp, and the evidence of her leaving for Jake made things pretty straightforward. She tried to argue for spousal support, claiming she'd sacrificed her career for the marriage, but the judge didn't buy it. In the end, we reached a fair settlement. She got a small amount of money and some of the furniture she'd picked out, but I kept the house and the majority of my savings. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than I'd expected. The final hearing was bittersweet. Sitting in that courtroom, signing the papers that would officially end our marriage, felt surreal. I glanced over at Laura a couple of times. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept in days. Her lawyer handed her a pen, and for a moment, I thought she wasn't going to sign. But eventually, she scribbled her name at the bottom of the page, sealing the deal. After the hearing, she approached me in the hallway. Mike, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. For everything. I looked at her, trying to see the person I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. But all I saw was someone I used to know. I know you are, I said. But sorry doesn't fix this. Her eyes welled up with tears, and she reached out as if to hug me. But I stepped back. Take care of yourself, Laura, I said, turning and walking away. Every now and then, I'd hear bits and pieces about Laura through the grapevine. Jake had apparently moved on to someone else not long after she came back to me. She was living with a relative now, trying to figure out her next steps, as one mutual friend put it. I didn't feel any satisfaction in hearing about her struggles, but I didn't feel sorry for her either. She'd made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. One day, I ran into her at the grocery store. We locked eyes for a brief moment, and I could see the guilt written all over her face. She gave me a small, awkward wave, but I just nodded and walked past her. There was nothing left to say. Looking back, I don't regret how I handled things. Laura thought she could have it both ways, that she could leave, explore her feelings for someone else, and come back to me when it didn't work out. But life doesn't work like that. I've learned a lot about myself through this process. I know now that I deserve someone who values me, someone who doesn't see me as a fallback option. And if that person is out there, great. If not, that's fine too. For now, I'm just focused on rebuilding my life on my terms. Laura's trial run with Jake may have been her idea of finding clarity, but for me, it was the wake-up call I didn't know I needed.